Good evening, everybody. My name's Ben Page. I'm the chair for this evening. I'm chief executive at Ipsos MORI. All I simply have to do is introduce the luminous panel on my right, who won't need much introduction, and their biographies are all in here. We'll hear from each of them in turn, and then we have a chance for questions, discussion, and debate. This is, I mean, we'll see in a minute, one of the most amazing technologies, and it's, if you look at things like the car, it took a very, very long time for the car to have the sort of impact mobiles are having on our society, and we really are only in the foothills. But I'm sure we'll have a massive argument about whether there's anything new in any of this, whether it's profound, whether it's not business as usual or anything else. And I'll just say welcome on behalf of the King's and Ipsos MORI partnership. There are drinks and nibbles upstairs when we've done, but we do want to hear from each of you. Please tweet along. I don't know if we've got we have a hashtag, Kings at Ipsos MORI. You've all got your smartphones. 64% of the UK population, now have a smartphone. But I know in this audience it will be even more. So get onto Twitter if you're not already. And Denise Lives, who's already joined Twitter, so she might be tweeting as well. Claire Emes is the head of digital at Ipsos MORI, a very good thing indeed in every sense, and is going to talk about what it might mean from our point of view. Claire.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm here today just to talk you through some of the statistics and the data that we have. I do have some more data, not just the 64%, but I thought perhaps it would be nice to start with this image, this fantastic image, as we have Ben Hammersley on the panel. This is from Wired magazine, and I think this says a lot.
Should I still pay you a bit?
This says a lot about the smartphone. This says a lot about the smartphone. It's showing us how we can fit 40 gadgets inside something that fits inside our pocket. That's what we're here to talk about today, to talk about the mobile phone. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Mischa and Ben have to say about the future. But today, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about people's views, their attitudes, and their usage of mobile technology today. Now, there's no doubt that the smartphone has had a huge impact when it comes to the way that we interact with each other, but also the way that we shop, the way we bank, and the way that we entertain ourselves. But how do we feel about the pace of change when it comes to the world today? So this isn't just about technology, it's certainly not just about the smartphone. 3 in 5 of us at the bottom here in the dark green, this is Great Britain, 3 in 5 of us actually feel that the pace of change is too fast. We can't cope with the speed of change in the world today. But when we look at it in the context of the rest of the world, we're actually doing quite well. We're actually okay about it. We're quite a mature market when it comes to tech change. But as individuals, we're quite split. So this question here, this is from our global trend survey. This tells us that we're split pretty much 50-50 when it comes to whether we personally can keep up with science and tech developments. Are they too fast? Now, we thought it would be interesting to have a look at smartphone owners versus non-smartphone owners. And I was quite surprised to see that pretty much just as many smartphone owners feel that the pace of change is too fast. Now, I think this could be because we're perhaps more aware of this change. We know that Apple's talking about launching the iPhone 6, and particularly with the smartphone, it's a badge product, something that says something about us, and it's a bit of a fashion accessory. So those of us that have a smartphone are perhaps more acutely aware about this pace of change and feel that we're struggling to keep up with that. When we look at age, we see a slightly different trend. So we do see that the older generation are finding it harder. They are more concerned about trying to keep up with the speed of tech changes. In fact, I'm going to steal a quote from Ben's book, where he's quoting Douglas Adams in '99, who talks about everything that's in the world when you're born is normal. It's what you expect. Anything that gets invented before the age of 30 is really exciting, and if you're lucky, you can make a career out of it. Anything after that is sort of against the natural order of things. It's a bit of a disaster, and it takes you quite a long time to come to terms with it. I'm not sure I'd agree with 30. I'm on the wrong side of 30 now for a start, but I think there's an important point there that as you get older, it is harder to get used to the speed of change. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about people's general attitudes to technology. how many of us do have a smartphone? Well, Ben's stolen the punchline there, but around 2/3 of us now have a smartphone, and that's pretty much doubled in the last 3 years. Quite an important point, though, is that this adoption hasn't been uniform across society. So I thought I'd start with showing you an innovation curve. Some of you would probably be familiar with this. It's from Roger's Diffusions of Innovation. But he talks about the types of people that tend to be picking up technology before others. So your innovators tend to be your sort of opinion leaders. They're very high income. They can afford this sort of £3,000 first smartphone. You've then got your early adopters who tend to be younger, higher income, before you get to your early majority. So if we go back 2 years, smartphone penetration is just under half, 45% of us. Fast forward to now, and we've tipped over that middle point. There's more of us now that have a smartphone than don't. And we're into this late majority. So these are people who still tend to be higher social class, but they're a bit slower at adopting. They tend to be slightly less opinion leaders than the others, but they are still willing to adopt. Another way of looking at this, and I apologise, this is a very busy chart, but I think it makes a very good point. This shows you smartphone ownership by gender and by social grade and by age. And if we look at the top left here, this shows you how, this is 2 years ago, how it was really only the youngest and the highest social grades that owned a smartphone. If you come down to the bottom right, you can see that you'd really struggled to find somebody a couple of years ago over the age of 65 with a smartphone. In fact, it's near on impossible to find a woman who's in a low social grade with a smartphone. Fast forward 2 years again, and you can see the growth in the green. So this is going from our early adopters to our early majority into, but here, again, we've still got only about 7% of women who are a low social grade that have access to a smartphone. My mother-in-law has actually finally got a smartphone, so she's one of the 15% here. But we'll talk in a moment about how people's usage tends to be different according to their age as well. So we've talked a little bit about who owns a smartphone and our attitudes to technology. But how attached are we to our mobile phones? Well, we asked people in our global trend survey, we gave them a list of things and said, if you had to give up one of these, which would you miss the most? We asked them to list 2 or 3. So this list included the internet, desktops, TV, and among all people in the UK, so in Great Britain, around 1/3 of us said we just couldn't give up our TV. We're very attached to our TV. But even more, so this is smartphone owners, among smartphone owners, even more of us wouldn't give up our smartphone. If we look at age, we can see a very nice trend here, as we've seen earlier. In older people tend to be much more attached to their television set. I know that my parents and grandparents always like to watch Countdown at a certain time. But if we overlay smartphone, we were quite surprised not to see the same trend there. And I think that suggests to us, certainly at the moment, with this, the types of people perhaps in these age groups who are picking up smartphones, they're not necessarily any less attached to them once they have one. So where do we sit with other markets? We're sort of middling in terms of our willingness to part with our smartphone. I guess it's not surprising that the emerging markets are quite high. For a lot of people in emerging markets, it will be their primary way of accessing the internet. They've leapfrogged desktops and laptops. But in terms of mature markets, we're actually pretty attached to our mobile phones. Another way of putting this is that 4 in 5 of us, within 15 minutes in the morning, have checked our smartphone. Half of teenagers admit to taking their phones to the toilet with them. 7 in 10 say that we'd be willing to give up alcohol ahead of our smartphone, and even 1/3 of us said we'll give up sex ahead of our smartphone. We conducted some research for Ofcom last year among young people. We did this on mobiles, and it was all about their attachment to their mobile phone and how they use mobiles and other forms of communication. And they provided us with some feedback about their attachment to their mobiles, and I just thought I'd like to share some of these comments with you. I cannot live without my mobile phone. If I left it at home, I would go back and get it and make myself late for work. I mean, I've done that. I don't know if anybody else is willing to admit that they've left their mobile phone at home and gone home to get it, but I have certainly done that. This one's great. I mean, it shows how much we've changed and how dependent we are on our mobile phones. I had to drive home without a phone. I mean, this woman, she just couldn't cope. She thought, what am I going to do? There's no phone if I get lost, what do I do? I mean, people don't have maps in their cars anymore. I can't phone someone if I break down. It's become a sort of a life jacket for us. Part of me was lost. Part of me was lost. It's very strong, but this is how attached these young people feel to their mobile phones. However, when we spoke to them, they also said that they appreciate the value and the importance of face-to-face communications. They all realise that. I'm not sure if it's the media or their parents, but they realise the importance of this when it comes to social skills. So this person said, I think face-to-face contact is really important. But I particularly like this quote. I've been out for dinner, so I avoided my phone for a couple of hours. Well done! But that said, I'm back now, it's okay. I've checked Facebook, I've checked WhatsApp, it's all sorted. And I think this shows you the dependence that some people have on their phone. And I feel like that. I mean, nomophobia, they call it. If I'm without my phone, I do get a little bit jittery. Baroness Greenfield talks a lot about this. Personally, I think it's slight scaremongering, but she talks about how she sort of compares it with climate change and suggests that there's now some mind change and it's physically changing our brains, that they're evolving. And it's affecting the way not only we communicate with each other, but how we empathise and how we sort of view our own identity. And parents are also very concerned about their children's use of mobile phones. As part of our technology tracker that we conduct every quarter, we asked parents about their children's use. And whilst parents want their children to have a mobile phone because they feel their children are safer, they can communicate with them, they're very concerned about what they're doing on their phones. So they said the two of the top activities were playing on video games and viewing video clips. But they also said that those were the two activities that they felt had the most detrimental impact on their children. So we're a little bit confused about how we feel about mobile phones. So are we making the most of our mobiles? This isn't the most scientific segmentation that Ipsos MORI has ever produced, but I think it's quite useful. What we've done here is among all this is among the British population. It shows you how people are using mobile phones. So we are mixing ownership with usage here. We can see that in the red here, and I think this is very important, it's the first time I've mentioned it, 12% of people in Great Britain do not have a phone, let alone a smartphone. We focus so much on smartphones, but there is a sizable minority of people who are completely disconnected when it comes to mobile. There are also a number of people that still have a feature phone. And even among smartphone users, there's quite a varied mix in terms of what we're actually using on them. I mentioned my mother-in-law. One day she's going to turn up at one of these presentations and I'm going to die. But she has a smartphone, but she tends to just use it for texting. Occasionally I'll send her a picture of her grandkids, but that's pretty much it. Only 3 in 10 of us are actually really using all of the features of our smartphone when it comes to using things such as online banking. How do we compare with the rest of the world? So on this chart, we've got some grey lines here that show the sort of the top and the bottom and where GB sits. So you can see that we're very heavy texters. We really like texting each other. I guess that's because we're quite used to doing it. We've had mobiles quite a long time. We also quite like social networking. In fact, as many of us access a social network now via our mobiles as they do via a desktop. We like to gather information on our mobiles, particularly about sport, especially today, but also the weather. We love the weather. And I think it's important that we bear in mind that this is very cultural. So I don't know if any of you communicate with people in Japan, but you shouldn't really text them. They don't like texting. Email them instead. So just to summarise at this point, I think it's worth saying that we're relatively positive about technology change. We're happy about that. 3/4 of us think that tech change is a good thing. But we sense that we're becoming too reliant on it. Actually, though, the immediacy and the convenience kind of trumps all of that. The younger and the more affluent are the earlier adopters, and they are making most use of their smartphones. But access to and the impact of mobiles is also starting to impact the older audience. The majority has a smartphone. Now, I think this has very clear implications for business and for government. We used to talk about how patience was a virtue. That's certainly not the case now that we all have smartphones. We expect immediacy. So I thought I'd start with what we're doing. This isn't meant to be a sales pitch. This is just purely to say we are a business. How are we reacting to this change? So we are changing the way that we are contacting our respondents, the way that we're doing our surveys. We're conducting much more via mobile. We are doing survey research in the moment so that we can understand how people think and feel before they post-rationalise and forget things. And also it's much more engaging and convenient for respondents. It feels a lot less like doing a survey and a little bit more like real life. Other businesses, these aren't necessarily the best examples, they're just ones that I know of personally, but I can set my TV to record using my smartphone. I can stream my TV walking around the house on my tablet. Change the temperature of my house, change the thermostat from a mobile app with British Gas. And government's also reacting. So I have an app on my phone which tells me about hygiene ratings so that when I'm out and about, it uses my location services and can tell me whether the restaurant I'm going to is any good. You'd be pleased to know that King's College gets a 4-star, so hopefully they're not going to poison us tonight. And also this one here.
You choose your restaurants on cleanliness.
I'm a researcher, what do you expect? This one here, this is a pothole application that was actually created by a charity, but the Department for Transport is supporting this. So as you cycle around on your bike, if you see a pothole, you can report it, which helps with efficiency when it comes to improving roads. I'm going to leave you on one final point before I hand over. We're all very, very excited about mobile and the implications that this has, but I just wanted to remind us all that we mustn't leave the 12% behind, those people that don't have a mobile. So we need to think about all of the excitement, we need to make sure that we're changing, but we also need to do that at the same time as remembering those who are slower to adopt. And also that even those of us who have adopted are a little bit concerned about the pace of change. So I suggest that we bear that in mind. I'm going to hand over to Mischa.
I'd like to introduce Mischa Dohler, and Professor in Wireless Communications here at King's. Mischa, the floor is yours. Are you going here or up there?
Can't do it here.
You can do where you like.
Yeah.
Okay. Mischa.
Now, the classical definition of an alcoholic is somebody who gets up in the morning to a glass of vodka or whiskey rather than a glass of water or coffee. And another definition is emerging. I'm quite sure in 10 years' time that will be a classical one as well, the one of a nomophobic, the one who's getting up to the mobile phone, checking emails, Twitter, Facebook within half an hour rather than a glass of water or a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. Now, the term nomophobic comes from no mobile phone phobia. Okay, so we're really afraid of not having our mobile phone around. It was coined in 2008, apparently in the United Kingdom, maybe by somebody in this room. And I would like to query this audience. First of all, let me normalize this set. So who among you actually has a smartphone today? Wow. So who among you is actually checking emails, Twitter, whatever, within half an hour before you actually have your first cup of coffee? All right. That looks really bleak, actually. So yeah, don't worry, you're not the only one, actually. So the majority of the planet actually suffering from precisely that problem. In the US, I've seen statistics, students on average handle 110 messages per day on the mobile phone. They're checking 60 times their mobile phone per day. Now, I had my eureka moment, really, and it was a very bad one. A few months back in Barcelona, I was at a traffic light, stopped the car, long queue, red light. Traffic light changes to green. Nobody moves, and nobody honks. Now, that is something really for Barcelona. And I'm wondering what's going on here. Look around, everybody on the smartphones. So before we were really worried for, how long do I have to really wait until I get on? Now we hope that the red light will just last longer and longer so I can really text and message and whatever I need to do. Now, if we look a little bit what technology has done over the past centuries, actually most of the technical revolutions really have helped us to make a better physical, meeting space, etc., for having people really easier to meet. Look at the car, look at the road system we're building, look at the airplanes, etc. Now the internet came along, the wireless edge came along, and it seems like it's not more difficult to meet now physically, but it's almost like superfluous actually to do that. And you see that today when you look out, mums and dads in the park, rather than playing with the kids, they're actually checking their mobile phone. They continue that in addition to the traditional trend we had of putting the kids in front of the TV. So we're getting an add-on here of leaving them behind. I'm wondering whether the next tech revolution will actually bring this into schools. We'll need to see how this plays out. But social networks, clearly, in my opinion, a very unfortunate term really, because networking is really about a bidirectional communications. Now, if you look actually at Facebook, Twitter, etc., you figure out there's nothing bidirectional about it, really. And it is a rather one way of communicating, a very narcissistic way of communicating. You have your followers, you're tweeting something, you get maybe one response, two responses, etc. And I had my shock moment in December last year when I realized that at that time I had about 50,000 Twitter followers, and I decided, at 50,000 Twitter followers, you expect when you send a tweet, you get a lot of interaction, etc. And it was quite lousy. You get 5, 6, 10 people, etc. You normalize it over your set of 50,000, and you realize, hey, Twitter for me was just my narcissistic window, a diary I was broadcasting, almost showing off to the world what I've been doing, and I deleted it. 1st of January, I deleted my Twitter account, so I'm now Twitter free. Feel free to tweet this, by the way. So that's a little bit on the downside. And, there are clearly pros and cons. There are more downsides, clearly, with all the technical revolution happening and the mobile edge really being so predominant, that being health issues. So people start complaining about headaches simply because I was told the blood flow is actually interrupted because we're always looking down. People are complaining of eyesight problems because the screens are very small. People are complaining of problems with the joints because you really need to hit essentially a very small screen. You have psychological problems, insomnia, we all have it. It's just such a news stream coming in, and actually news streams which makes virtually no difference to your life. It's very much noise essentially on your daily entropy. On the other side, of course, it brings a lot of benefits. Now, a massive benefit, personally to me, is it pays my job because we're designing these systems. Another good thing is really, if you look at the whole digital economy, it's about 8% of the GDP. 8%, that's enormous. And 50% is wireless. It's the edge. It's the mobile phone, the tablet, it's your computer on the run, etc. So that makes about 44% of the GDP. It's a $100 billion economy we have bootstrapped within the past decade, not even, from this opportunity here. Now, to conclude that, and maybe relate a little bit to the findings which were presented earlier, one thing I completely agree with is maybe we have an opportunity to look at the red numbers you have seen. So those who are the elderly people, etc. Who actually, those who can't move, who have difficulties in moving, who maybe need really remote health care, etc. It's something we have completely underexplored, and I think there's an enormous opportunity there. Overall, the data set is surprisingly unsurprising. So I presume if you see these type of statistics, every now and then, whether, it's the mobile phone, back then the internet, before that the car, before that whatever there was, the horse, etc., probably would come up with the very same numbers. Maybe some countries would be different, etc. But overall, the statistical distribution seems to fairly constant over these centuries whenever a new piece of technology is being introduced. Thank you.
So Ben, how excited are you about mobiles?
I'm super excited. I'm always excited. Especially when I've had some of that delicious King's coffee. I spend, hello everybody, hi. I spend my life really looking at innovation and looking at new technologies and looking at their effects on society and the world and geopolitics and so on. So I attend a lot of these things, most of the time in your position and some of the time in this sort of position. And as Mischa says, I see a lot of these sorts of figures. And it's really interesting that the same arguments are brought out every decade, pretty much every decade for the past 3,000 years. Every new technology that comes along, and especially a new medium, especially a new sort of communications tool, the same things come about. The same sort of language comes about always. There's always discussions about whether or not these things are rotting our children's brains. It's always good. I mean, sometimes it's the ancient Greeks talking about the invention of writing and how that's going to ruin their children's ability to memorize long poems, which was a thing. And and then it was the invention of the novel, because obviously if you're reading a novel, you're living inside an imaginary world, and that's obviously got to be really bad for you. And then you have all, television, rock and roll or jazz. The syncopated beat will cause your heart to beat out of rhythm, and that's obviously not very good for you. And so every new technology comes along with the same sort of questions that are being asked. Are we dependent on these things? Are they dangerous to us? Is there something we can do about it? Oh my God, my children are doing a thing I didn't do when I was their age, and this is obviously bad. Because in my day, we used to play in the streets, and, Jimmy Savile was wholesome, and all of that stuff. And so it's really important to look at the technologies, and not as a technology, not as a gadget or a box or a thing with a screen or a battery or whatever, but look at exactly what it is that those things actually do, the actual purpose of the device, not the device itself. And then make a decision about whether or not that purpose is itself dangerous, or or whether a dependency on that thing is dangerous. I am also one of those people who checks their phone when they wake up in the morning and whilst I'm making my coffee. And the reason for that is because I am not looking at my phone. I am looking at the world. I am not dependent on my phone. I'm dependent on the relationships I have with my friends. I'm dependent on the news, I'm dependent on the information, I'm dependent on all of the relationships and good things in my life which happen to, in 2014, come to me most efficiently at 7 o'clock in the morning when I'm pacing around the kitchen being chased by my cat through my phone. I'm not dependent on my phone, I'm dependent on my friends. And that's a very important thing to remember about these sorts of technologies. When we have this debate about whether or not digital technologies, and the same thing goes for social networks over the past few years, endless debates with people like Baroness Greenfield about the brain-damaging results of Facebook, or how friendships aren't friendships if they don't involve playing conkers, or something like that. But of course, those things are entirely misgiven. They're entirely mistaken arguments. Because it's not about the technology, it's not about the software, it's about the thing that they enable. And so another way of asking that question is, do you have lots of friends with whom you like to keep in contact before you have your morning coffee? And if the answer to that is yes, that's actually kind of a good thing, right? Are you the sort of person who wants to check the news before you've had your morning coffee, and you don't want to shout at the Today programme? Well, that's probably a good thing too. Everybody here has a smartphone and uses it for their own particular use, and that particular use is probably an inherently good one. But it's nothing to do with the phone itself. And so when we start talking about these technologies, I think it's very important that we examine not only the technology, but the language that we use to discuss that technology. Because hidden within the questions that we ask, and indeed some of the questions that were asked in this survey, but the general questions that are asked within the general discourse around new innovations, hidden within that language, hidden within those questions, are assumptions that themselves take on a whole series of meanings that we might not necessarily understand. Questions about dependency are actually questions about power. They're questions about should we, whoever the we is, parents, the government, society at large, allow those people over there, the young, the female, the poor, whatever it is, to do this activity that we are not entirely in control of through these devices that we don't entirely understand. And an awful lot of the time, that's the question that's actually being asked. It's nothing to do with dependency and whether or not our kids are, our kids are fine or it's causing them brain damage. It's, they're doing something I didn't allow them to do explicitly. Should I continue to allow them to do that? Because and that's a very important and interesting thing to think about. Because after all, whenever you take on a new piece of technology, you take on the culture that's embedded within it. So a good example of that is, who here had a BlackBerry once upon a time? Right. So a BlackBerry was the physical embodiment of a cultural idea that your inbox was the most important thing in the universe. If you were given a BlackBerry by your company, for example, they were giving you a physical manifestation of the political idea that even if you were reading your kid a bedtime story, that blinky red light was going to continue blinking until you answered the damn email. It was actually a physical instantiation of the idea that your inbox was, that you couldn't leave work ever, that you were taking your office with you wherever you went. It was culture embodied in the device. And these things have culture embodied in them as well. And we haven't had enough of a discussion about what that culture actually is. But the culture is the thing you do through it, not the thing itself. To have that discussion, however, requires a whole new critical language, a whole new way of discussing these things that doesn't involve words like dependency, or even words like innovators and laggards, an inherently value-driven set of descriptions. So I think what is very interesting to move on from this sort of cycle every 10 years of a new technology coming on and us having a quotes debate about whether or not it's harmful, and then looking back 30 years later and giggling at ourselves. I mean, remember video nasties, or video games giving you brain damage, or the old joke, if video games gave you brain damage, then all the young people today will be in dark rooms eating white pills, listening to electronic music. And of course, that never doesn't happen. But that's only you and I get that going. Anyway, but these new technologies come along every 10 or 20 years, and we have the same discussions about them. And the discussions, we're not discussing the thing we think we're discussing. We're actually discussing interpersonal relationships and power relationships, and nothing to do with the technology itself. And I'd like to get back to discussing the technology itself. And when we're talking about dependencies, absolutely I'm dependent on my phone. I'm dependent on my phone for bringing me all of the good things in life.
Well, so culture, power, it's not actually about any of the technology. Who wants to go first? Any observations, reactions, provocations from the audience? We have microphones. You have a BlackBerry. You're going to tweet us? Hang on, wait, somebody's bringing you a microphone. Tell us where you're from, and then so we know what your angle is. I don't know if we have a client in BlackBerry and various other people. I don't know if they're here. Right. Okay. You're not from BlackBerry.
Is that better?
That's better.
Yeah, I'm not actually from BlackBerry.
Okay, that's good.
I've had a BlackBerry for many, many years, and this is actually my third 9900. Right. And this morning before going to work, it decided to break down, and I actually had to send an email to my boss saying I have to sort this out ASAP. So I went straight away to the nearest phone shop and bought a new battery, and then it was resurrected.
So is this a false consciousness your boss has imposed on you in terms of this dependency on this device for communicating with him, or is it something else?
I ended up using my iPad to contact my boss, but it's actually my personal phone.
Okay.
But I explained that this is my external organ, so can't come to
One of our colleagues is the idea, you two must be riffing on this one, the idea that this is your exobrain, and the art of memory is now dead, if it ever was alive.
The art of memory was always dead. It was just that we used to use address books, right?
Yeah.
Or Rolodexes or whatever.
Yeah.
The fact that we now carry it around with us is... Okay. We can fetishize the ability to memorize numbers as much as you like, but it's not that exciting a talent.
Claire?
I kind of agree with Ben to a certain extent, though, because I mean, I have young children, and I have experienced that red flashing light when I'm meant to be reading a story, and I do want to, and I do look at my phone. But I also think it's a real enabler. I work part-time, I work across offices, and it allows me to sort of work when it suits and where it suits, and I don't think I could do my job and have the family life that I have if I didn't have the ability to sort of check my phone and do what I do. So I think there are some real positives. I think we can be very downbeat when it comes to the impact.
But this is my point, is that you've taken a discussion which you should be having with the CEO of the company you work for, who sat next to you, about whether or not you should be working at the same time as you're reading your kids a bedtime story, and turned it into a discussion about having a phone. This isn't a discussion about having a phone. This is a discussion about working practices and conditions in the 21st century, or job security, or the economy, or whatever you want to call it. But we take what are fundamentally much more important and much more difficult conversations and sort of concentrate them into, like, you know, all about whether or not the iPhone is evil.
So we fetishized it.
No, we're using it as a massive red herring. This is the thing that prevents the awkward conversations from having. So like,
So how does what does the professor of wireless technology say to that?
Maybe not a technology issue, really. Actually, piggybacking a little bit on what Ben said, TV came along, and before TV came along, the culture was we talked really to each other. TV came along, there was friction clearly. Some people wanted to talk, some people were just sitting in front of the TV, and then that was clearly, not a good thing. Now it's standard. It's okay for you to sit down, have your beer and watch football for 2 hours, and nobody really judges you. And now comes the double thing on that. So the mobile phone comes along, and a lot of friction. We've seen the picture there. The couple actually, looking to the digital world rather than looking at each other. And it's not okay 2014, but probably our kids kind of grow up with that, and that will be the social cultural norm by 2020. Until they will experience something very similar. I'm not sure what that is. That is the unknown unknown.
So now we even have, I've seen articles in the sort of papers you would imagine that you'd see such articles, talking about, mourning the fact that people's families no longer sit around the television together like they used to. And because now everybody's got their own screen, and so little Jimmy's off watching Game of Thrones over there, and somebody else is doing something over here, and so like, I remember the good old days when we all used to sit around and watch the same program and then discuss it like some form of brains trust or something. Of course, all of this sort of nostalgia about the good old days where we used to sit in drawing rooms and have long erudite discussions never happened. Never happened. And so we take, again, it's taking our modern day neuroses about things like family life or working practices and going, well, we can't possibly talk about that because it's terribly English, but what we can say is the iPhone, I'm dependent, I'm so dependent. And just taking all of those problems and placing it into a technology. And we'll do this every decade. We did it 10 years ago and 10 years before that, 10 years before that, and we will, whatever the next thing is, when Oculus Rift launches at the end of this year, which is amazing, right? And virtual reality kicks in, and it's a big thing. It's the big Christmas thing in 2016. We'll be having exactly the same debate in 2017, going, my kids are dependent on virtual reality, and in the good old days, you used to use your eyes and have natural photons.
Ben, as chair, I need you to explain Oculus Rift to some members of the audience.
Oh, okay. So you may remember from about 20 years ago, there was a thing called virtual reality, which were goggles that you put on with screens in, which would track where your head was and where you were looking, and it would change the picture, and you would it would feel, it was supposed to feel as if you were inside a digitally created world, sort of like Tron at the time. And these first came out about 20 years ago, and they kind of didn't work because the graphics were pretty bad and it was very laggy. So you'd move your head, and then the scenery would catch up with you. There is a company called Oculus Rift, and there are 3 or 4 others who do have a similar technology now. Oculus Rift was just bought by Facebook for $3 billion, something like $3 billion. Oculus Rift is the headset that actually works, and all of the reviews of the prototypes have people completely blown away. If you go onto YouTube and you put in Oculus Rift, an Oculus Rift old person. There's lots of videos of the developers putting one of them on their grannies, and their grannies freaking out because,
and that's really just the beginning, really. So it's
Yeah.
like the old Nokia of the mobile era. So I think, as that evolves, you wouldn't be wearing these big goggles anymore. You have an overlay lens, whatever that takes.
And it's a very compelling experience, and so we can absolutely see that they'll be sold in the high street in a year or so's time, and then in a couple of years' time we'll be having a thing where all my kids are using Oculus Rift all the time, and it's and I'm a bit worried because can't they get back and doing Facebook like I used to do?
So it sounds like we really shouldn't worry at all then.
No,
I think
you worry about.
Yeah, we should.
Right. Okay.
One question just to add on that. So, one question I'm personally always worried about or interested in is why innovation happens so at this pace, so slowly. Actually, why don't things happen earlier? Why didn't Gutenberg appear 500 before Christ, which we would be like equivalently now in the year 3014. Okay, so the question is for me really is how quickly can we just bridge over that mobile phone era where we still have to watch like the screen and type in things and see the world through that really bulky device. So that I think is seeing the question from a different angle. How could we accelerate things? What is holding us back actually?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example of that is through one of these whenever you can get signal.
Yeah.
It's quite sketchy up here on the stage, but nevertheless, through one of these, I can access pretty much all the information in the world. I can get live satellite pictures from pretty much everywhere on the planet. I can find out the football score. I find out pretty much everything I want to do. This gives me superpowers, the likes of which are basically unimaginable even 10 years ago. I have more intelligence, like secret intelligence coming to my phone than the President of the United States did 15 years ago. I am hyper connected, I have more information than I can possibly know what to do with. And with the Internet of Things and all these other technologies coming in, I'm going to get even more powerful. I'm like bloody Iron Man with one of these things. And so is everybody else in this room. And so the fact that we're talking about it, the question really is, why aren't we solving more problems? We've got these amazing tools.
We mostly just play games and text our
Yeah, well,
friends.
we're always going to mostly just play games.
Yeah.
But the question is, why aren't we looking at these new technologies and instead of going, oh, well, I'm a little bit worried about keeping up with the pace of change, and instead saying, why aren't we accelerating the pace of change and solving, using these technologies to solve a whole load of social problems? And instead we seem to be worrying about, people in Islington who couldn't possibly change the video recorder. I get little Jimmy to do it for me.
I have a quick question for you on that. So I suspect, and I agree with what you're saying, but I suspect that if we'd asked people about the pace of change in the late 19th century, they would have also probably found that half of us were worried about the invention of the telephone, and if we go back to 15, 16, they'd have been concerned about the invention of raw mail and the postal service. However, the fact is, people are telling us they are concerned about the pace of change. So what do we do about that? Do we help them? Do we educate them? Do we forget about them? Or is it just something we shouldn't?
I think we have to look at exactly what they mean by what the change is that they're worried by. Mm-hmm. Because an awful lot of technological transformation where people were worried, like you say, about previously it could have been the Royal Mail or it could have been the invention of the car or something like that. It wasn't the technology itself, it was the social changes that came with it. And so people were worried about electric light because it brought about specific social changes. People were worried about the invention of the washing machine because it suddenly liberated a whole gender, right? People were worried about the car, and specifically the cheap car, because suddenly poor people could travel to places. People were worried that there are with every technology comes a social change, and I think it's the social change that people are most worried about, not the technology itself. If you don't want to have a smartphone, fine. You don't have to have a smartphone. Don't buy a smartphone. Nobody's forcing you to buy a smartphone. But we live in a world where smartphones exist, and with that and with the things that comes from those technologies, the decentralization, the access to information, all of those sorts of social changes, will come massive social change, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. And it's the social change that we need to debate, not the technology. If we continue debating the technology, we'll completely miss the key point. Mobiles are particularly interesting, not in the UK, but in the rest of the world, and specifically the developing world. I was in Nigeria a couple of weeks ago, and all the way across Africa, mobile telephone, smartphones specifically, they're pretty much the only way they get online. And that is radically changing society in the developing world. And we need to be talking about the social effects rather than saying, oh yes, but they're going to be staring at screens for a long time and they won't get enough fresh air.
There's somebody at the back waiting to come in, but Mischa, do you want to say something?
Well, just let me add quickly.
Right.
So, on whether we should be worried or not. So, from the statisticians in the room, having seen the numbers, there are no big surprises. We know these rules, 80-20. So you've seen a lot of 80%, 20%. Other effects bring in 50-50. We have loads of Gaussian distributions or uniform distributions. There's not so much more you can find in nature. It seems to be a very universal law. And actually the brain works that way. It's very conservative most of the time. So most of the time we just go about routines, maybe 80%. And 20% we just go crazy, which is our exploratory phase, which I guess brought us out of the cave, which gave us the car, the airplane, the mobile phone, Steve Jobs. So it seems to be just a trend, a general trend, and I agree, we just have to probably get on with it in one way and make the best out of this. Not get on with it, make the best out of it.
Sir.
Seems to be a lot of literature and research that says or talks about the importance of nonverbal communication between people, and that sometimes 90% of effective communication can be nonverbal. Do you think that's true? And if you do think that's true, or it's partially true, how does it factor into this new medium of communication that removes many of those physical cues that you would get? Thank you.
That research is, I've seen a lot of research in the same way, that the majority of high bandwidth communication involves lots of body language and other such things. That's entirely right. But that doesn't, the absence of the perfect doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the good. And if that was absolutely the case, we wouldn't have a library here. Because of course, the perfect way to get across any form of knowledge is to hear it directly from a live lecturer who can expound and wave their arms about a lot and write it down. But we can't do that, and so we have books. And so to say again, it's mistaking the method of communication with the purpose of that communication. You can get, as anybody here who is on Twitter or WhatsApp or any other form of short form text communication thing, it's actually an incredibly rich communication medium once you understand the rhythms and the vernacular and the way of communicating, especially within a small group, within a social group that is well known to each other. Twitter is actually very rich and full of sarcasm and irony and all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect to be able to get across in 140 characters. And so, yes, absolutely, it would be fabulous to have all of your social relationships in the fresh air, in the sunshine, face to face, entirely in the moment, completely, locked onto each other, and so on. But that's just not how the world works. And so the fact that I can sit here and whilst I'm waiting for everybody to come in, continue 4 conversations with people in 4 different countries and 4 different time zones, even if that conversation is solely made up of short sentences and me waving at the camera, that itself is infinitely better than not being able to communicate at all, apart from face-to-face in a full-on, high bandwidth way.
I agree. We'll throw you a microphone. You may have to shout. Okay.
You go to a music concert and you're there and you have an opportunity to organically really experience that, but look at the picture on the top of your thing. Actually, that's a really good example. But perhaps you experience it through a screen, and therefore it takes away that organic experience. And the same as you're having Christmas Day with your family, but are you there if you're self-editing and thinking about what that experience might play out like in social media, which part of that social media, not the phone, but the phone enables that. So I'm a massive advocate of phones, but I feel like there's something that's bad about them in that sense.
Yeah, I'm sure Ben has something to say, but I actually do agree with you, and maybe that proves that I'm getting old. It is, for me, it's a big problem. So I'm organizing a lot of conferences, and maybe among the social scientists it's not a problem, but engineers, so I've taken recently a picture of ICC's, one of our big comms conferences. There's everybody with a laptop. Nobody is listening to the speaker. So when I organize conferences, I actually cut off Wi-Fi. People get angry, deprived, okay? But then after 15 minutes, they suddenly start to engage again, and some really good discussions come out of that. So I agree with you. So it's, you know, it's a thin line, and there's really an opportunity that once you come actually physically together to make more out of this than just being the medium, the portal for somebody else to the wider world.
I think we have quite a schizophrenic opinion on all of this, and I think we showed that earlier with the data. I think part of us is very excited, but part of us is also quite scared about it. I mean, my opinion, and I do this a lot with my kids, my opinion is, yes, it is slightly detrimental that I'm there with a smartphone when they're doing a nativity play, but I can then replay that and enjoy it again. They get to see it, which they love doing, and I can share it with their grandparents. So there's, I think with a lot of things, it's pros and cons. And to the point at the back, I think some of this is temporary. So things like FaceTime allow us to get some of that back. So quite often I'll be talking to, you know, family members on the other side of the world, and we can see each other. I also think that from a research perspective, there can be some benefit to not necessarily being face-to-face with someone. When we were talking to the young people for this Ofcom project, they're quite used to communicating via their mobile, and sometimes people are a bit more honest if they're not there with an interviewer face-to-face. So I think with a lot of these things, you can argue both sides.
It does, however, beg the question about whether or not a mediated experience, as in one where you're taking a photo of it, is worse than a direct experience. In fact, there is a school of thought that by experiencing something through something else, or by experiencing something whilst doing something else that requires concentration, you're actually concentrating on it more. You know, we would never ever, or I've never heard of an academic taking this stage, for example, and giving a lecture to a whole load of students and saying, right, I don't want anybody to take any notes. Because if you're taking notes, you're absolutely not in the moment with me. You know? Yeah, quite possibly, but maybe the thing about that is that is the experience that they're having. That you assume that you go to a music concert to watch the band, but actually that's not true necessarily. You might go to that. Some of these people may have gone to that concert because their concert-going experience, the whole sum of the thing they like doing, you know, getting dressed, having a drink, going to the thing, you know, meeting their friends, but you know, all those things, seeing the band, taking some good pictures, you know, colouring them in nicely in Instagram, posting them to wherever, you know, putting in a little caption, waking up the next morning, seeing all the comments from their friends on Facebook. You know, that's the full experience. Maybe, right? In the same way as like when the same way as when I'm watching the England game, whenever it is tomorrow, right? My experience is going to be watching it on the screen and watching Twitter. Because the football experience for me is watching the thing and watching Twitter at the same time. Now, if somebody was to say, you know, you're not really paying attention to the football, are you? You would have a much purer experience if you were to put the second screen away, then it would be a much worse experience for me. And so I think, it's all about trying to make somebody else do something or stop doing things you don't want them to do. Like, it's like enforcing a behavioural norm, which isn't necessarily the best behavioural norm.
But isn't it just loss aversion? You know, we don't like change, we regret losing things we think are disappearing.
Maybe, but it also seems that we don't like change in other people's behaviour. There's nothing to stop you to going to a concert and leaving your phone at home. But what seems to upset everybody is that other people going to a concert and taking pictures, as if that's...
something we will explore in further research.
Didn't Prince ban? Yeah, I think Prince banned at his latest concert. I think it was in America.
Coldplay did something recently.
Yeah, they actually he banned mobile phones, and
have the real live experience.
Yeah.
But all those copyright as well.
He was really angry. He actually released a statement, I think, about him.
Any more for any?
Yeah, if I could just add,
Sorry,
I think Ben's made some very perceptive points this evening. Firstly, that nostalgia is a distortion of reality. And as a consequence, a lot of the arguments don't stack up. Secondly, that the phone is a medium. And as a medium, it connects you to the world. And it's our relationship with the world that's changed. Thus, the medium becomes part of that. What I would like to follow on the last question, just as a means of perception, is that really whether the phone is constructive or destructive is dependent on the individual. Only the individual can make that final decision. And I think that that point needs to be particularly thought about. The granularity is the individual. It's not the society as a whole. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. And I think that constantly asking whether or not questions like, are we as a nation too dependent on our phones, is actually, in even asking the question, is taking a stand against the individual. Because it's laying in a social pressure against the use of a phone that the individual may find incredibly rewarding and completely helpful and hopeful and good for them as individuals. So whenever, for every single article in the Daily Mail that says, mobile phones / social networks / VHS / Pac-Man / whatever are rotting our children's brains, there's a whole generation of kids specifically seeing those and thinking that they are freaks for not being damaged by this thing, which they take enormous amounts of pleasure and utility from. And so we have to be very, very careful in giving almost like brain space to these big social questions and not realizing that it's about, like you say, about the individual and about the things that are enabled by these technologies, not by the technology themselves.
Some of the things that we've debated in this series have been around sort of individual rights, liberty, control, and where it's good for the state stops us doing certain things, sometimes for our own good, sometimes some will argue to protect the status quo or the people who benefit and run it. But if you were looking at this from a public health point of view, which of course is where Baroness Susan Greenfield's coming from, and Ben Goldacre will give her a good thrashing if he gets half a chance. Maybe there are some issues. We want to be protected from certain things, from smoking. I love drinking, but I don't really need, I need to be discouraged. I try and discourage myself, but I'm quite pleased when I'm discouraged as well. I love it. I'm not alcoholic as far as I know, but I do like it. And maybe the same with my phone. Maybe I need more holidays that I can check in where they take my phone away from me. I think the Hilton in America now offers this. You check in and your phone's, and that'd probably be good for me.
Well, Mischa first. Well, okay, me first. Yeah. Me first. I think we have to be very careful distinguishing between things which have been shown empirically to be bad for you, like smoking, and something that we have a vague suspicion might be sort of contra-nostalgic, like the mobile phone. The question always sort of reminds me of the Chatterley trial. A lot of these questions could be easily rewritten as, would you approve of the mobile phone for your wife and servants?
Yes, yeah.
There's a certain subtext to these questions of, I as professional journalist am perfectly fine with my iPhone, but of course, you proles out there may well find that Facebook is dangerous. Beware. There's an awful lot of that, and especially you get that with the sort of slightly darker bits of the internet around, say, pornography. Listening to politicians debate internet pornography is simultaneously hilarious and aggravating. It's aggravating from a technology point of view because they just don't understand the internet. But it's always hilarious because it's massively patrician. It's like, I may well be very kinky myself, but you people, you're not allowed to see breasts at all. We've proven it's bad for you. And it's the same, and we have to be very careful about technology. Smoking is not a good analogy because smoking genuinely is bad for you, whereas everything else is just a matter of aesthetics.
Let me just give the opportunity you have with the phone. So turn that around. So clearly you can prove that probably there is some impact. I talked about some of that. But clearly you have, and we work on this actually at King's, you have maybe a small hospital, real-time hospital, just carrying around with you all the time. And some of my friends didn't make it to the age I've made it, and I wish they could have had these tools to have the real-time sensors telling them that something is going wrong with them. And that's the opportunity, really. So rather than saying, okay, that's a problem, let's just turn it around and say, what can we make out of this to actually make this a helpful kind of device?
I mean, just to pick up on Ben Page's analogy of smoking, I agree that I'm not sure it's quite the right analogy, but the point I would quite like to raise is passive smoking. So sort of the passive mobile, because as a mother, I do feel quite guilty when I am checking my phone, and my children have said to me a couple of times, stop looking at your phone, mummy. And that's not really a value judgment. That's not somebody from the press, that's not my boss, that's not anybody saying you should or you shouldn't. That's me not giving my kids attention. Now, I guess you're probably going to tell me that's a completely different question. It's nothing to do with the mobile device, but the fact is, I like what I get from my mobile device. I want to keep in contact. I've got used to that now. It is a bit of a drug for me. And even when I'm with my children and I work, so I don't see them all the time, I am guilty of not giving them the attention that they think they deserve.
So I'm afraid by 2020 that will be social norm. This is, what
so
I
they
meant.
won't be saying, stop that, mummy.
But what Ben was saying, we're articulating all the time, TV probably 20 years ago was the very same thing, and now that is okay.
Is that a good thing?
Well, maybe you either need a less interesting job or more interesting kids. I mean, because that's what's happening, right? You have an attention competition, and it turns out that the thing that you're accessing through your phone, not your phone, but the thing you're seeing through it, is more interesting than your kids are.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I shall tell them to I'll tell them to up their game, shall I?
Do you have children, Ben? Right.
Not yet.
Okay. Any more observations? Right, we've got a few people over here. Okay, let's we'll have 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Anne Murcott at SOAS. I'd like to come back, Ben, if I might, on some of the points you were making, because when you started to say it's about social relationships, it's not about the actual phone in your hand, I thought, good, couldn't agree more. And then you started talking very importantly and interestingly about power and how, your boss is expecting you to be dealing with this thing even though you're having to put your kids to bed. But then you agreed with somebody whom I didn't see, saying that it's down to the individual. And I thought, well, hang on a second. You're implying that somehow, unless I misunderstood you, that the individual is completely free to not take the phone to the gig or turn it off, or leave it upstairs and look after the kids downstairs, or whatever it might be. And how does that square with your pointing out that actually it's about power, and that to ask whether people are too dependent on the phone is to miss the point? It's actually what is the relationship between those, the individual and the person who they are worried about or having to attend to when that little red light is blinking.
I see what you're saying. It squares because I'm not saying that the argument has been had. I'm saying that we need to have that discussion about those relationships, about the power relationships, and so if we can just forget about the phone itself entirely, and start to say, well, actually the real discussion is, workplace conditions or whether, or the discussion could be about, we could talk about, are friendships more performative today than they used to be, for example? Is a friendship, are interpersonal relationships based on a sort of a two-way performative thing of, I'm friends with this, I'm friends with Mischa because I show off in front of Mischa for a bit, and then I sort of step back and he shows off in front of me through some sort of digital medium, and therefore that's our relationship. I don't know, right? But it's not about, I think I'm not saying that the theory is solid. I'm just saying that there's questions to be asked to create a theory, which will enable us, but we'll never get that if we're constantly talking about the phone rather than that.
I couldn't see how, I entirely agree with what you just said, but I couldn't see then how you could agree with somebody who said it seemed, as I understood it, well, it's all down to the individual. You can just detach yourself from these power relationships.
Oh, no. I'm saying that...
So when you agreed with the previous speaker, or questioner, what were you agreeing with?
I was agreeing with the fact that each individual, we were talking about, for example, I'm trying to use different words. This is why I don't come and talk at universities. I was talking because my wife is a social science PhD, and I can hear her voice in my head going, "You don't mean that exactly, do you?" Thank you. Bring me wine, woman. I think that what we're aiming for is a situation where people's use of technology is a matter of individual choice, because your use of technology reflects your personal activities and your personal interests and your personal choices. For example, I find the use of my phone to be extremely rewarding because of the things that I do through it. Then we shouldn't, as a society, mandate against a particular form of the use of that technology. We should allow the individual to choose whether or not they want to use that technology, because the choice is not about the technology, it's about the activities they do through it, which are subject to individual choice. I hope to God that made sense.
No, I think she meant something else. I think the problem she meant is, you don't have the choice anymore. You're kind of so hooked to that, right? Is that what you meant?
No. This poor gentleman was trying to get a word in. I'll shut up in a minute. No, what I meant was that you're implying that people will make individual choices completely independently of relationships, particularly power relationships, where they may be less powerful and therefore not as free to make the choices as ideally you're implying. And that's my point.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, no. I'm saying there is basically, like, we're talking about the what I was complaining about was the idea that there was a sort of a higher level of power relationship, which is sort of society in general being disparaging about the use of these technologies, which was over and above the things that you do through.
Oh yeah, no, I wasn't. I mean, I was picking up on your good point when you were talking about it was work relationships.
I was possibly being an idiot.
You're not the only one trying to say something. I'm also trying to say something here. So.
What are you trying to say, Mischa?
I'm trying to say is that, I think the whole issue is not about how much information we receive, actually. I think this internet, whether mobile or fixed, is driven by a very narcissistic kind of agenda. It is the ability to have your own TV station, your own personal broadcast channel. And if you look at it, probably all of this is based on that, whether this is somebody posting something about him or herself, whether that is a BBC just trying to, kind of broadcast some stuff, whether it's King's College showing off some courses, etc. There's a very kind of, the internet has enabled that. So it's not the influx, the thing. What is powering the whole paradigm is the outflux. This is what really is the paradigm, in my opinion.
Okay.
Which is why I deleted my Twitter account.
Okay. I just want to come back. I'm Bob Burstow from the Education Department at King's, so I'm involved in teacher education and hence the education of children. I think we do have to worry about the technology. I was reminded as you were talking about Bill Tagg, who was at the University of Hertfordshire many years ago, back in the 1980s when IT was first coming into schools, and he used to talk about the half-life of technical innovation, which was the point at which 50% of the user population was on board. And he described it as like half-life decay curve. And his thesis was that half-life is diminishing for each new round of innovation. Now, I just want to give you 2 examples of this. In 1961, I was 11 years old. 1961, there wasn't a lot of IT around. And my head teacher said to us, and I've never forgotten it, I think my proper class teacher was ill and he'd lost the will to live by about 2 o'clock. And he just talked at us. And he said, I think you are the last generation who will have to learn facts. He said, I think the next generation of teachers should be teaching their pupils how to ask questions. Now, I don't see that that's really happened yet. What I think we do with the technology, with each technology that's come in, Ben, the ones you were mentioning, is we learn and develop as a society an etiquette to handle that new technology. Now, if Bill Tagg was right and the half-life of technological innovation is diminishing, we don't have the time to evolve an etiquette before the next revolution happens. And so, to come back to something you were saying, here we are still working at the etiquette of operating with our children. And by the way, at nativity plays, I can handle iPhones, but when it's iPads, and then everyone behind has to treat it like a stadium concert. No. I'm also very pleased my mother has died, because she used to warn me about not worrying about strange people in the street who used to talk to themselves. And she never saw Bluetooth arrive, so I'm very grateful. But what about this increasing speed of innovation and our need to react to it? Are we moving, is it moving faster and destroying our ability or undermining our ability to evolve an etiquette?
Just very quickly, I think humanity has done pretty well actually until today, frankly speaking, you know, without learning really how to maybe ask questions, just learning facts. And maybe again it's a 2080. So that would be my quick answer to that. Ben, your long answer.
Yes, I mean, the development of etiquette around technology is absolutely a thing. We've had that with every new technology that we have to learn etiquette. And again, you're right, I think that's entirely right, that the accelerating pace of especially digital technologies has created this issue. You know, it took us 20 years to know not to have a phone on in a restaurant or in a theatre, and now we have, you know, the time to new products does seem to be accelerating, though that could be a sort of narcissism of the present, because whenever we look at technology, you know, if you take any 20-year period over the past 200 or 300 years, there's always a massive changes. You know, the 50 years around 25 years either side of the turn of the 20th century, the technological changes then you could quite easily say were much more difficult for society to deal with than just sort of, you know, a new gadget every few years, and, you know, going from a feature phone to a smartphone to whatever happens next. The invention of the car and the washing machine and household electricity and electric light and all of those different things. So yes, you may well be, that may well be right, but it may well be just be narcissism, like I say, of the present. But nevertheless, what are you going to do? You know, unless we become Amish, and the Amish, there's a good example, the Amish don't reject technology, they just said we're not having any new technology from now on, and they kind of set a date where they said, right, we're kind of done, right? So either as a society or as individuals, we just become Amish and just say, right, you know, I'm done now, I'm never going to buy another phone, I'll always be an iPhone, you know, 5S user, and then we'll let them. Unless you do that, then we have, as a society, we have to continue on. And to continue on, as I said right at the beginning of the evening, I think what we really need is a new critical language to talk about technology, which doesn't use these sort of now so wide-ranging words that they become meaningless, like dependency, or even privacy is another good one. Privacy is such a wide-ranging word now for technology that's pretty much meaningless. So we need more debates, but we need and more discussion and more academic work, but they need to be working with whole new descriptive words about our relationships to each other through those technologies.
Okay, somebody else up here. 2 more.
Hello, I'm a 17-year-old, And whenever I go to a party or any social gathering, there's also always two types of different people. They're the people that are happy to socialize and communicate with everyone, and then there's the people that sit in the corner, avoid all social contact, and sit on their phones. And they're not using phones as you're using them to learn more. They're just avoiding any contact with anyone because they're afraid to talk to anyone. And I think it was you, Claire, that said that it's the people that are without phones, that we shouldn't leave them behind. Are you sure it's not the people that are sitting there on their phones that are being left behind?
I think that's a really good point. I would suggest, I mean, it was a little while ago that I was 17, but there were those people then, we just didn't have mobiles. They just had to find something else to do, because there are some people, especially at that age, who aren't perhaps that great at dealing with people face to face. And so I'm trying to think what they used to do, but they certainly
sat around. They used to read books.
No, not at a party. Well, not the sort of parties I went to.
Or they just wouldn't go to parties.
At parties.
I think nothing has changed really.
Yeah, again, I think what you're seeing is just a symptom of just teenagehood, right? That now, previously, when I were a young man, like those of us who would sit in the corner in parties would either be in the kitchen, which is where you'd hang out, or we'd be at home reading a book, or doing something else.
She's specifically talking about those who are at the party, and I think really nothing has changed.
Yeah.
In my opinion, there's still those. So I see, in my time, there was those sitting in the corner, and those actually.
Or maybe the ones at the party are enjoying the party and the music and the drinks and everything, but are finding better conversations through their phones. So maybe the problem isn't with the ones on the phones; it's the ones who aren't on the phones being boring.
Yeah, I mean,
just not compelling enough. Like you're going like, well, I've got 140 characters or a real life person, but the real life.
There's a rich vein of research emerging from this event, which we're going to be following up. Does something else want to come in up here? Okay.
That's a good question. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
We've talked quite a lot about personal culture, etiquette, individuals, and stuff. But what would the panel say about the surveillance potential offered by mobile phones, and indeed the interest that large institutions have in us all carrying them?
Now, Ben and I were part of a Snowden panel just a week ago. How do we go about it?
But it was under the Chatham House rules,
so we can't really talk about it. Yes.
But even mentioning that we were there is actually now broken.
Is that true? No, we can say that. All right, how do we go about it?
you can say what you said.
Oh,
that's your view.
That's true, yes. Okay, I'll start from a technical point of view. He has been talking a lot. So let me just share you some insight how we handle that. So, we knew all the time that we could do what has been done. So whether you collect mobile phone data, banking data, etc. I'm not even talking about, wiretapping, the phone, the internet, how the NSA has done it. Just collecting ordinary data you've been generating yourself for the past 20 years gives a lot of insight of you as a personality. Now, we have recognized that, and the whole privacy issue has come out, and it has become a little bit of a hackneyed phrase without actually having solved anything. But from a technical point of view, we're trying to address that by designing what we call the future internet. So the future internet, the current internet, has scaled so quickly because we paid attention of having every machine speak the very same language, which is the IP protocol. Okay, so as long as your mobile phone, your sensor, your computer speaks that IP language, it can talk to any other one on the planet. That allowed us essentially to scale it up very quickly, but we have all the notion of what we see now with the NSA scandal, etc. So what we want to do now is to essentially put privacy by design in there, so a machine will not be able to talk to the internet, to the whole ecosystem, unless it has this thing enabled. And that will not be a switch on and off, because we need to have more discussion on that. It will be something more subtle, really. It will not be something which will grow higher walls, because a lot of the internet really functions because we can collect a lot of data. Google, whether you like it or not, is a very useful thing. So imagine we just don't have Google anymore. We have to still call our, 1080, what number, I don't know which number that was, to get your information about what you want to know. It's a big bill you will get. So Google is powering that based on a lot of data it's collecting, really. So we want to get it right, and we want to make sure that, privacy is not enabled within the application, so yourself have to do it, etc. But it's really part of the whole engineering design. Okay, and I think that's very good news. It's not something that will happen now, maybe 10 years from now, but we are at it. We recognize it from a technical community. Now I'll leave it over now to the more social, geopolitical, etc.
Yeah. It's a really difficult question. It's a difficult question because it touches so many different strands of argument. The internet as a whole, you know, the whole thing, the technical systems, the socio-political systems, the cultural systems, all those different layers on top of it, are so much a good thing and so deeply entwined with our world that to turn them off or backtrack on them or whatever would basically be impossible. And so we do now find ourselves in a situation where we can only go forward. We can't go back. We can't just turn the web off tomorrow, no matter how much anybody would like to, because of their own particular corner of it is hurting. One particular corner of the internet is hurting them individually or as an industry. And so, with all of these questions, we have to talk about how do you go forward. And with the surveillance argument, there are really two. I think there are two angles to it that we have to discuss. One is government surveillance, or bad guy surveillance, where we are suspicious of the institutions that are gathering this data and why they're gathering it and what they might do with it in the future, and sort of good guy surveillance, where we can come to a conclusion that although it might be a little bit weird and new and possibly a little bit creepy, the gathering of that data could actually be very, very useful and a very good thing and actively improve the lives of everybody on the planet. And the problem that we find with the internet at the moment is that the good guys and the bad guys are, a lot of the time, the same people, and they're doing it with the same data. So if you speak to Google, for example, Google will say, well, we want to suck up all of the data that we can possibly get, because through that, we will be able to do amazing things. And we will also enable people to do amazing things. If you speak to GCHQ or in the NSA or any of those sorts of agencies, they say, we want to be able to look at this data because we want to be able to protect you from people who want to do really, really bad things, which is itself an inherently good thing to do, one would assume. So we really have to have a discussion about the ethics and morals of this sort of stuff and the way that society reacts to it, but we have to do it on the basis that the technology exists and not debate whether or not the technology should continue to exist.
I would like just to add very quickly on that. So what really worries me is actually not what we have seen now with the NSA, etc., because we had, a whistleblower. Well, we debated whether he really is one, but we had somebody who has spoken out. Probability of that happening was high because a lot of people were involved, actually. As time evolves, technology evolves, suddenly, we have thinking machines, we have robots, we have drones, and a lot of stuff which now human with a conscious are doing will be done by machines which have no conscious, no soul. And suddenly you end up just with maybe 1-2 people knowing about the whole surveillance issue. And of course, the probability of a leak then is very, very low. That is something which genuinely worries me.
I'm not asking you necessarily to answer, but I'd be interested to hear why you can't tell us about your meeting last week and what you discussed.
Chatham House rule, and we're just not allowed. I mean, that's the deal when you go to meetings at Chatham House. They just don't let you. And if, they'll be upset. And they could have us killed. Just as a thing, there are, whenever you look into new technologies, you always find things which are really, really terrifying. And it's actually not the movie plot terrifying things that I think are the things we should be worried about. It's not the government has got a secret agency that's reading our emails and controlling the world. Those sorts of things are invariably not true or not really that big a deal. What's actually, to me, really terrifying is the accumulation of lots of small changes. So take Google, for example. Google did Google Street View. So, you can go onto Google Maps and you can see the street. You can see pictures of pretty much every street in the UK. And they've done that all the way across the States as well. And that technology enabled them to then build the self-driving car. You may have seen pictures of that or video of that. So they have a self-driving car, and they're about to start selling them in California in 2015. Get in the car, you say where you want to go, you press go, and then it just drives you there, and it's artificially intelligent and all that sort of thing. A couple of companies that are doing this. Now, that's really cool and interesting. However, this morning it was announced that the Dutch have done the same thing with all of the streets around Holland, and specifically around Rotterdam, where the big port is, and that from 2016 they will be allowing driverless trucks to drive out of Rotterdam port in convoy and deliver cargo from Rotterdam port across Europe. Now, that's simultaneously super cool. As a technologist, I'm like, that's amazing. Robot trucks delivering my stuff, coming off massive container ships, coming from the most high-tech port in Europe. However, if I was Eddie Stobart, I would be bricking myself right now. And if I was the Teamsters or the Truckers Union or whoever, whatever the equivalent is in Holland, I will be looking at all of my members losing their jobs within the next 5 years. And so the problem isn't necessarily things like, what can a movie plot threat do, or what's the Orwellian nightmare? It's not the Orwellian nightmare that I'm worried about. It's the slow destruction of an awful lot of jobs and communities, simply because if your work can be replaced by a computer of sufficient power, it will be. And we've now got to the point where computers are of sufficient power to start replacing real people very, very rapidly. So taxi drivers, truck drivers.
Given you the normal arguments that you've been employing earlier, surely this is, we're back in Manchester in the 1760s, and the spinning jenny has just arrived, driving all those good souls with their home devices for spinning out of business.
Right, and it didn't end well for those people.
But is this quantitatively different?
It's not.
It's not, no. And again, it didn't end well for those people.
Well, they found new jobs elsewhere. I'm now the editor of The Economist. They found new industries were created. That's how capitalism works. It was all fine in the end.
That's right. And I noticed I noticed the massive employment in Sheffield and South Wales at the moment. Or around the Glasgow shipyards, or all those things. Now, everybody in this room is going, well, that's all right. Those are blue-collar jobs, and I don't drive trucks for a living. But just to give you the real fear, IBM supercomputer Watson, which was the one that was on TV a few years ago as the competitor in Jeopardy on American television, they've started training it to do white-collar jobs. So when they stopped playing Jeopardy with it, they started feeding it medical textbooks and medical journals. And it's now actually quite a good doctor. When they last announced it a couple of years ago, they said it was 50% accurate in making diagnoses. Which
50%
means
accuracy.
Which means that just through Moore's law and just general programming capabilities, you're going to get it, 80, it's 51%, whatever, right? But making a thing of I don't know what it is, and that's definitely the flu, is actually pretty good. Now give it a few years, and you're going to have your GP as an app on the phone. Now, if your job can be replaced by basic medicine, is basically a big ass flow chart, right? Are they alive or dead? Dead. Stop. Alive, continue. And you work your way down through the flowchart until you come to a diagnosis. Now, there's quite a lot of white-collar stuff which is exactly that. If you were a solicitor, for example, who just did basic conveyancing and things like that, or contract law, you might be looking at that and going, actually, you know what? I don't like to admit it, but the very highly paid job that I've got is basically just a big flowchart I've just, spent a few years at school memorizing. Maybe I'm going to be replaced by Watson. Or bank traders, 70% of the bond trades in the city today were done by artificial intelligence, not by a person. There was no human input whatsoever into the vast majority of the financial market.
Stop scaring them. Look at them. It's a beautiful thing. You can go to the beach.
So maybe the only thing left is teaching, right? Or teaching the teachers.
The MOOCs will have you. The MOOCs will have you. Any more observations from the audience? Questions? Okay. Well, good. Come on down. The microphone is yours.
Hi there. I just had a question around about how living through our mobile phones and things like Twitter is changing our behaviour to each other potentially, and just what you think on that. I'm just thinking this week of Phil Neville commenting on the World Cup, and it didn't go down too well, but a lot of people actually kind of say things on Twitter that I think they wouldn't say face-to-face to someone. And it's just increasing massively kind of some quite unpleasant and kind of terrifying behaviour. So I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Are we back to the development of an etiquette for a new technology, or are we seeing a massive antisocial rise being facilitated by it?
I don't think we're seeing an antisocial rise. What we're seing is an unveiling of already latent antisocial techniques. I mean, there is a thing called the online disinhibition effect, which is where, because you can't see somebody's immediate reaction to it, because you can't see their body language, you can't see them go like, you can't hear the upset in their voice and things like that, then people are more likely to be, more mean on things like Twitter. There is also a phenomenon that people don't, especially in places like Twitter, they don't think they are public fora. They think they're sort of, no, it's just that the way that they act is that you think that you're its own, like Facebook and Twitter are not really public, they're sort of semi-public because you have to choose to follow somebody. It's not really a public thing until people start using the search function, at which point it suddenly becomes public, and it wasn't necessarily intended to be public. And so there are lots of quite deep things about the way that it's about the way we communicate online. But it isn't creating antisocial people, it's just revealing that people are antisocial. And because when you start looking out for antisocial, and specifically misogynistic behavior, because oh my God, there's an awful lot of misogyny online. Once you start looking for it, you will definitely find it, and you will find it in such concentrations that it will make you think that the world has actually become a horrible place over the past few years. And that's not true, it's just that they were always sexist. It's just that now they're allowed to say it in semi-public and do so.
Yeah, I wasn't going to touch on misogyny, but I think it's a really important point. And I'm thinking about the discussion we've had so far and wondering how different it is to say hate mail, which could be almost anonymous. But I think the difference there was that it tended to be directed at, you knew you were posting it, you knew where it was going. Not that I've ever sent hate mail. But with Twitter and Facebook, I think you're quite right that people don't necessarily realise what they're saying could get back to that person. I started off, like everybody else, laughing at all the comments about Phil Neville because he was terrible. But then suddenly I started to think, oh God, what if he's actually seeing, and he must be seeing this while he's commentating. And you suddenly get this real sense of guilt. And I think the other thing that's important with social media is this sort of herd mentality, that once somebody said something, or a few people have said something, you've got this critical mass, or somebody that you're following that you trust said something, it's okay to say that. And I think that's quite a worry. But just because we like stats, I'm going to say one stat. Only 18% of the population are actually on Twitter, and half of those under 35. So it's just something worth bearing in mind when we're talking about Twitter and who's saying what.
I would like actually to disagree really completely here. So and that's one of the drives why I went off Twitter actually. I think it's naive to think that people don't know what they're doing there. I think the majority does know. Clearly there will be a small part which genuinely is insulting people, but maybe other people who are kind of being insulted are a little bit like looking for attention, because you have to remember the currency on Twitter is retweet, favors, and engagement, okay? So people are really after this currency. This is like your bank account there, and this is what, in my opinion, is driving Twitter as a community altogether, and Facebook and Twitter have captured this me element so beautifully. That's why we are hooked to that. It's just really about myself.
I think people perhaps use it in different ways. I think you're right that there are some people who like to be retweeted, others just use it as a form of communicating with some of their friends and their trusted followers. But
the invisible psychologist, I call it, Twitter.
Yeah, that's a good example. Facebook is a good example of that. Facebook is not a social network. Facebook is a company that facilitates tens of millions of social networks. I'm on Facebook, I'm sure you're on Facebook. We're not in the same, as far as I think it might be, I don't know, but we're not in the same social network, and so the fact that we're both on Facebook is irrelevant. And it's the same thing with Twitter. It facilitates social behavior. Now, if it also exposes social behavior that you don't necessarily approve of, so for example, on Twitter, every so often I like looking at the American Nazi Party on Twitter because they're hilarious. They're amazing, right? And you can, by clicking around who's retweeting them and following the links that they go, you get into this amazing online communities of American Nazis, none of whom can spell. They're fabulous, right? Now, I'm not a Nazi, you know. I'm not, and so I'm not going to start following them or become part of their social network. But by dipping into their network, I can amuse myself. But if I did that a lot, I would start to think that everybody on Twitter was a Nazi, and I would start talking about the rise of Nazism in Illinois.
I'm going to give a last question to the millennial again. You have the microphone.
Thank you. This is on a slightly different topic, but if anyone's interested in the growth of technology and when it turns in from a utopia to a dystopia, there's a Disney film called WALL-E, or WALL-E, and it's about, I don't know if anyone's watched it, but it's very good. It's about how living in a world of technology might not be as good as we think it is, and how the growth of technology you might want to stop it. That's it.
I would dispute this message, but
yeah,
have you seen it?
I have seen it. It's a great film made with some very good computers.
By the way, watched on the TV.
Yeah, exactly. Watched on a screen.
Yeah.
Whenever people talk about being worried about the about the rise of technology, I do wonder about which technologies, if you could roll the clock back, which ones we would get rid of. I really like technologies. I'm a big fan of penicillin and heating.
Obviously, when anyone creates a new thing, they don't realize that it has disadvantages. They always think about the positives.
I think it's an interesting point. I've just finished reading a book called The Circle by Dave Eggers, and I didn't think it was a fantastic book, but it scared me a bit because I started getting confused about what was happening in real life and what was in the book. And that's sort of quite a dystopian, has quite a scary ending. And to your point, Ben, do we stop? When do we stop? We can't stop.
We don't want
to stop. We don't want to stop. But still, at the end of the book, I thought, God, I don't know if I want to live in a world like that.
Well, then don't. Make a new one. I mean, this is another thing about the debates about technology. Debates about technology are always as if we've hit pause and we're now going to talk about it. It's like, well, we've invented the modern world and now we're going to stop and critique it. Well, the best way to critique a technology is to make a better one. If you don't like the internet that you find, if you don't like your experience through a smartphone, make a better one. And the amazing thing about the web, the genuinely impressive thing about the web, take Facebook as an example. Facebook was founded 8.5 years ago. It's now 4 billion people, 5 billion people, 3, whatever it is. It's in the billions. 8.5 years in the billions. The genius thing about Facebook, the almost unique thing about Facebook, wasn't that growth, unprecedented as it is, but was the fact that Zuckerberg didn't have to ask anybody's permission to make it. It was the first mass media, the internet has enabled the first ever mass media at such huge scale where nobody's had to get a license, nobody's had to have permission from somebody. There wasn't a leader or a ruler or somebody that they had to go and, pay. And so if you don't like the modern world as it is today, go and make a new one. Because I'm going to be in that new one tomorrow. So I hope you turn up too with something else that's cool.
So trust in humans and trust in the fact that we're going to make this better.
Well, what else are you going to do? I mean,
On this positive note.
Just to come back to the question, I think, the critique of that particular film was maybe not the technology, but rather we are depleting our planet, literally. And clearly technology has led to that, but technology may also bring us out of this. So I'm personally involved with the Carbon War Room initiative. It happens to be quite a big initiative on the planet with Richard Branson, etc., backing this, whether you like him or not, but he's really looking at technologies which could make this planet really carbon neutral, so we could go on innovating, doing business, etc., whilst not harming really the environment, and technology is the only answer there.
I'm going to stop this now because somebody wants a drink. The drinks are upstairs. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody in the audience for coming, and of course thank you to our speakers.